Hello and welcome to the New York State Archives webinar module series on record scheduling, a family of short presentations providing overviews of topics related to retention and disposition of government records. This module's topic is appraising historical records in the local context, and my name is Dennis Riley and I will be your presenter. As part of this module, I will introduce appraisal as a core archival activity and its relationship to a records management program. I'll discuss basic principles and practices of appraisal and present concepts relating to the idea of archival value. I will also cover basic criteria on how to identify records with historical value and discuss the importance of documenting your appraisal decision. Appraisal, at its most basic, is an assessment or analysis of the evidential and informational value of material. It should be emphasized that in this context, we are concerned with archival or historical value, not monetary value. Monetary appraisal is contrary to the professional ethics of archives and should be left to other professionals, such as auction houses. Archival appraisal seeks to be an objective process in that we resist personal bias or knee-jerk reactions. As such, we need to ask certain questions about the content and context of records that might affect their enduring value. Essentially, the who, what, why, and where regarding the materials in question. Our analysis weighs answers to these questions, prioritizing which records have the most research value and represent the essential evidence of a particular function, event, or community. We ought to make an informed decision based on our answers instead of making a seemingly capricious decision or relying on gut feeling or instinct. We'll be getting into these issues in the process throughout the module, but first let's put this in some context of records management and other archival activities. Identification of archival records can happen throughout the records lifecycle, though often the earlier we can do so, the better. This is especially true regarding electronic or digital records. During any active or inactive use, you can apply proper handling, filing, and storage techniques to safeguard archival materials. And if you have identified historical records throughout the life cycle, you can ensure such materials will be in good shape at the point of disposition. At disposition, you might review materials before destroying them once they have met their retention requirements. And appraisal can support allocation of resources so that your permanent records are made a priority. I also want to place appraisal within the context of core archival activities. Appraisal is often considered the most important archival activity because it is where tough decisions are made as to what will be considered permanent and where we will devote finite resources to the preservation and access of materials. In some respects, it is the process from which all other archival activities flow. We can't keep everything. No repository has enough resources in terms of staff, space, time, or money to do that. Appraisal ensures we prioritize and only retain the essential evidence of government and the human experience. On average, we like to say only 3 to 5% of government records are deemed to have sufficient value to be considered archival. And as Gerald Ham, a former president of the Society of American Archivists, once proclaimed, quote, "Our most important and intellectually demanding task as archivists is to make an informed selection of information that will provide the future with a representative record of human experience in our lifetime." So if appraisal is so important and demanding, why can't the state archives tell you what is archival in the local context? To be clear, the state archives has sole authority to appraise records of state-level agencies and government entities for their enduring value. We work with state agencies to identify historical records and develop appropriate retention and transfer guidance of such records to our custody. The situation with local records is somewhat different. The state archives does provide guidance in the local government retention schedule. Some items are assigned permanent retention periods to series which have gone through the State Archives appraisal process. These include primarily records with ongoing administrative, legal, and fiscal value, or records which will have historical value for all local governments. We also add appraisal notes to some record series, about 90 right now, advising that the series may have historical value depending on local variables and experience. But we are not in the best position to evaluate every local context given the wide variety of local governments and communities across the state. For instance, which of these might have more value, an 1885 cash book or a 1978 ledger? As with so many archival questions, it depends. As I noted, appraisal is an analysis of a multitude of factors or questions. And while we might be tempted to draw conclusions based on the information provided here, on face value, we are missing important context about these records to reach a reliable, defensible conclusion about the relative historical value of each. So let's dig a little deeper into the concept of archival value. The first notion of value I'd like to introduce is primary and secondary value. This is not to be confused with primary source or secondary source. Records typically are considered to have two use values, especially in the US archival context. Primary value represents the value for which the records were created in the first place. For example, a set of materials or records were created for a specific reason, which might be fiscal, legal, or administrative. Understanding the primary use of records is important if your appraisal is meant to document government processes and programs. Understanding the context of creation will help inform the historical value of materials. However, as a rule, local governments, or really organizations in general, do not create records solely for their historical value. Instead, determining that value is part of conducting appraisal. Some records have historical importance beyond that for which they were created. And this is secondary value, which does not imply that the value is any less. It simply means a value other than that for which the record was originally created. For example, wills are created for legal reasons in order to settle an estate, but that initial importance ends when the estate is settled. Secondary value would then include information about life in the past, the social status of an individual, and maybe the monetary value of items at a certain period in time if there's an inventory of property attached, for example. School census records are initially created for administrative reasons, but their secondary value can provide us with much information as to the number of students, their ages, and ethnicity, as well as information about teachers and the educational experience. Likewise, tax assessment rolls are primarily created to collect taxes, but their secondary role can be very useful for genealogical research or economic studies as they reveal the relative wealth of communities. Historical value can be divided further into evidential and informational value. These are not mutually exclusive. Within the context of New York State, records have unique and enduring value as evidence and information about the operation of government and its impact on the people of New York, as well as the people and events which shape New York history. Earlier, I mentioned that appraisal is based on answering certain questions. So significance depends on factors such as these: when the records were created, what kind of information do they contain, who created the records and why were they created, what records exist or don't exist, and for the local context, what is the unique history of your government or community? We will explore these concepts more later when we talk about how to conduct appraisal. Another type of value I'd like to discuss is intrinsic value, which is separate from the contents of the material. On occasion, the physical form of records or a particular document may have value or be the subject of an area of study or expertise. Book bindings or end papers document how volumes are fastened together and demonstrate the quality and weaknesses of past production techniques and technology. The uniqueness or age may also provide intrinsic value. If we think of the Gutenberg Bible, it has historic value because of how it was produced and when it was produced, even though copies of the Bible in general are commonplace. Or we can think of the state copy of the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It's not the official copy, but it still has immense historical value. So intrinsic value can include whether or not the physical form leads to a level of authentication because of the type of paper or parchment or the type of ink that is used. And there might even be policy or legal significance because of wet signature or wax or raised seals. This aspect of intrinsic value may be becoming less of an issue as born digital records, electronic signatures, and the like are increasingly accepted as official copies and are legally admissible in court. But intrinsic value can also include exhibit or educational value, or because the particular record or set of records are linked to an issue or person of significant public interest. Just a note of caution. Just because something is old or perhaps considered historically neat is not always sufficient to conclude it has intrinsic value. This justification should be used sparingly, if at all. Few government records will rise to the level of intrinsic value. And in fact, few archival materials are retained solely on this basis. Appraisal can be time-consuming, so doing it at an aggregate level is more efficient. It can lead to greater consistency and a more cohesive overall historical record. Records usually are not appraised item by item. Otherwise, you risk cherry-picking items without a solid appraisal foundation. Appraising at the macro or functional level or at the series level is usually a solid approach. A series is a group of records filed together because they all relate to the same activity. The materials are generally managed together, indexed together, filed together, and ultimately disposed of together. Treating a series as a cohesive whole during appraisal also helps retain important contextual information about the materials, such as provenance and original order, which are important to other core archival activities, such as arrangement, description, and access. Sometimes a few records within a series might be worth keeping, even though the rest of the series can be destroyed. But in almost every case, the records should be appraised as a group. For example, as you ask questions about a series, you may identify certain portions that might have historical value because of what happened during a particular time period, whereas the majority of the series has no enduring value. So to appraise records to see if they are historically significant within your context, you'll want to collect background information about the history of your government and community, and then ask your questions and make your decisions based on your answers. We'll dive into the types of questions and the decision-making process next, but first, appraisal can be a subjective process. The more you know about your government and the history of your area, the easier it will be to make a good decision. This helps place records within a larger context of use, function, and purpose. And you don't have to appraise alone. In fact, good appraisal decisions should never be left to a single individual. Get help informally or formally from your municipal historian, a records advisory committee if you have one, or other people who are familiar with your government and the community it serves. In the life of any government, there are certain periods of time that are especially important to its development or to the development of the community, and you'll want to identify these. Significance generally corresponds to a widespread effect on the community and broad impact across several government departments, but it can vary. Some examples include years during which the government was being established, a period of rapid change, either due to population growth or industrialization, or any period that had a great impact on the future of the area. Single events which affect the community and have lasting effect include disasters, division of neighborhoods, highway or infrastructure development, the building of a commercial center or a railroad, or the establishment or closure of a major industry. And so records created during these periods are more likely to be significant. And you can get information about this again from your local history, historian, current and former local employees or officials, annual reports, official meetings, and news clippings, or even long-term residents. You'll also want to assess the various functions of government. Identifying information about how departments operate can be useful as it helps the appraiser understand the office that created the records. In this regard, you want to identify the principal functions or office activities and the historical development of a department or office, such as when it was created, any changes in its duties or jurisdiction, the chief administrators or key players, and any special events that influence its operation. And while these functions are sometimes hard to discover, information is often available in a number of places, such as annual reports, budgets, or published material, manuals, and administrative histories. As mentioned a few times now, the appraisal process is one of asking questions. These can fall into 4 groups within which are more specific questions that you may want to ask. These all serve as useful appraisal criteria, helping you to make an objective decision about what records to keep. It also provides you with the documentation for your decision. So let's dig into each of these 4 categories separately. Question 1, when were the records created? The age of the records or the particular time period during which they were created may increase their significance, but asking just their age isn't enough. Significance of really old records is not so much their age, but often their scarcity. Because most records from early periods do not survive, every remaining record becomes more important. The problem, of course, is defining what we mean by old, especially since every document will get old if kept long enough. Records from 1789 may be obvious, but what about 1989? Old records may not be archival, so you also must look at other factors. Are the records scarce? Even records that are fairly recent may be scarce, and this is where your government situation is unique. For example, if a fire in the clerk's office destroyed most of the records dating from 1960 to 1970, then records that remain from that period may be more significant. The state has partly addressed this issue through state law in that you may not destroy any records created before 1910 without the written permission of the state archives. Why was this law put in place? Not because these records are old, but because of the state Capitol fire. There is a scarcity of state-level records before 1910. You'll also want to consider whether the records cover a long or short period of time. Those that cover a long time period provide more complete picture of government than those that cover only a brief period and tend to be more significant. And then you want to know whether the records are from an important time period. This is where knowing your local history is critical. Question 2, why were the records created? To answer this question, you need to understand the department that created the materials and its functions. You want to know why the records were created because you want to preserve the essential evidence of how your government did its business. So you can ask what office created the records, and this is usually easy to answer. Hopefully the records themselves tell us that office or department or program unit. But what are the principal functions of that office? Each department or entity has one or more specific functions which it has responsibility for carrying out. The key question is, do the records being appraised document those primary functions. Once you understand the function of the creating office, you need to decide whether or not the records in question document those key functions. For example, if the materials were created by a fiscal office, you may determine that the principal activities are to prepare and recommend an annual budget, maintain fiscal and banking records, and report annually on fiscal activities. You want to preserve a record not how every employee performed every small task, but of how the office overall fulfilled these principal functions. In particular, you need to determine what is the best set of records to provide the evidence of these functions. Records that preserve the essential evidence of the office's principal functions are normally more significant. Question 3, what is in the records? Do the records cover important activities of an office, government entity, or community? Are they non-routine records? Do they contain more in-depth information on people, places, or events? Certain activities are routine and the records that result from them are repetitious. For example, purchase orders or canceled checks. Their range of information is often limited in scope, and such records tend to be insignificant historically. Records that are not routine are more likely to include important topics. You also want to question whether the series is a unique source of information or whether the materials are the only source or the best source. Do they dispute other information held in either other offices or other series of records? Do they provide information on a local, statewide, or national scope? Are the events documented unique within or beyond the local community? And are they different from other governments and communities in New York? And finally, you want to ask who created the records. With this question, we are asking what individual created the record, not what department. That was handled in question 2. As you ask this question, you should determine whether or not the records reflect a point of view, and this will depend on the type of record. With routine housekeeping records, the individual who created them is of little importance since they are completed in much the same way by all employees. For example, payroll reports, purchase orders, or employee time records. However, government employees often create records that reflect an individual point of view, most often with documents such as correspondence or narrative reports. Whenever you encounter such records, questions about the person who created them can help you gauge the significance of the records. So, for example, what is the official person or position of the person who created them? High-level managers get a bird's-eye view of the entire government, and their records reflect that fact. Of course, significant records can be created by employees who are not high-level officials, so you also need to question whether the creator was personally involved in the events recorded, and did they have the necessary expertise to understand the events or topics that are being documented. The usefulness of the records depends to a great extent on how dependable they are, and the creator may influence this. And finally, does the creator exhibit a bias? If so, the appraiser must be careful to examine whether that bias diminishes or increases the historical importance of the materials. Even when a bias exists, the records may be historically important to document the fact that such a bias was present. So, for example, if a report is from a department head who is clashing with the city council, it could be said to be biased. Of course, related records from the city council could also demonstrate a bias. Having the two sets together would show the difference of opinion. Both could be wrong or both are biased, but it would at least show how an issue was being handled. A quick word about born digital or electronic records. When it comes to appraisal, we want to adopt a media-neutral approach to born digital records. In other words, bits and bytes are no different than paper. The format or media of a set of records is not generally part of our appraisal criteria. However, electronic records require more proactive intervention, ideally closer to the point of creation. It is useful to embed appraisal when designing any system or workflow and to develop a more proactive process. When appraising electronic records, you need to be aware of a variety of elements such as these, including the technical environment, which includes hardware, software, the operating system, the structure and arrangement of files, and any database elements. Authenticity relates to authorship and dates, the ownership and responsibility over files, data accuracy, and its completeness. There may be access restrictions, including encryption or passwords. And then electronic records come with very complicated preservation issues, often because of proprietary file formats. Duplication is a particularly thorny issue with electronic records because multiple copies can exist in multiple locations, including multiple backup systems. And on occasion, there may be a question of the actual physical storage media, whether it's floppy disks or CD-ROMs. Generally speaking, when dealing with special format materials such as electronic records, you will want to undertake a separate technical appraisal to better understand the nature of the records and your ability to preserve and provide access to them. Once you have asked all the questions, you'll review your answers. Don't make your decision based solely on one aspect of the materials. You want to assess all the factors, and then you'll make your decision whether to keep the records, to discard them, or to sample them, and I'll talk more about sampling next. And then you'll document the decision, including what reasons did you base your decision to keep or discard, and more on this in a bit as well. Very briefly, let's discuss sampling as one approach to retention of archival materials. Sampling can reduce the bulk of homogeneous sets of records to achieve a representation of the whole. For example, case files are often when a sampling approach is applied. Sampling can be quite complex, so contact the state archives if you think a sampling method is appropriate for a particular set of records. In general, there are three kinds of purposeful sampling. There's the true sample, which is the reliable representation of the whole, often based on statistical probability. There is the selection approach, which is based on either identified criteria or subjective values. This may be to document a specific demographic or segment of the population. And then there are the true examples or exemplars that are kept solely for illustrative purposes. For example, you might retain a canceled check from a defunct local bank, which helps illustrate local commerce and increasingly an obsolete transactional document. But this last type, it should be used sparingly. A variety of criteria can also be applied to your sampling approach. The FAT file is one approach on the presumption that a thick file will contain more details and more significant information. You can establish criteria for significance or notoriety, or even categories or hierarchy, again, if you're trying to document particular demographics. The systemic approach means you're going to keep every 5th or every 10th file. And then there's the true statistical probability, which involves some math. So when is sampling acceptable? There are some questions to ask, which I think are also good overall appraisal questions. Are the records homogeneous? How are the records arranged or maintained? Can a sample represent the essence of the larger body of records? Is there an index or a cross-reference or some other linked record? Would a sample provide sufficient evidential or informational value of the whole? And what are the trade-offs or the cost benefits in sampling, the resources versus the research value? The basic of the sampling dilemma is whether it is better to retain a small number of complete series or fragments of many. And one possible local government sampling scenario are the final tax assessment rules held by municipalities when the warrant copy is held by the county. The retention is 10 years after filing, and there is an appraisal note. A systemic sampling approach, for example, may be useful in capturing a sample snapshot of community economic conditions every 10th year to coincide with the federal census, or possibly every 5th year to also capture the midpoint between federal census records. And sampling is one approach that the state archives use is with inmate case files. Because we can't physically retain every inmate case file, we have come up with a somewhat complex formula to result in a representative sample of the whole. Documenting your decision is important. You should be able to demonstrate your analysis and justify your decisions. This can be a narrative memo that explores the context and content of the materials and lays out the answers to your questions. You can use a checklist or even a standardized worksheet to help document your decision. The format is less important than the fact that you do it. It is important to document your decisions so that, first and foremost, you don't have to appraise the same records over and over again, but it also serves as important evidence to future researchers and others as to why certain records exist and why others might not exist. You also want to have clear written appraisal policies and procedures. Why are these necessary? Well, written policies are tangible leverage to resist mission creep and to defend your decisions. They help manage expectations of researchers, executives, and other officials, and the public. They help establish constraints on your collecting activities, and they help focus your collection practices and not just to legitimize them. Policies and procedures help ensure that the intended outcome results in complementary, interrelated collections. And if they're not in writing, they're just some oral tradition that is unreliable. These should support or complement your overall documentation of government actions, decisions, and programs. Your procedures should enumerate your appraisal criteria, the process and how decisions are made, who gets to make the decision, and how they are documented. And you can include your appraisal criteria and evaluation process can include a variety of factors which align with what we've been discussing so far. The source of the records, the informational content of the records, their physical characteristics, including their condition, volume, and any accessibility issues, their content in terms of time span and completeness of information, their use, and this can include actual or potential uses of records, particularly their research use, and their context, the relationship to other documentation held by the local government and other repositories, whether that's other local governments, historical societies, other archives, or even the state archives. Some final thoughts. Keeping everything is not possible or practical. Keeping more stuff does not equal keeping the essential evidence of government programs and their impact on communities. Always consider why you decide to keep or not keep materials permanently. Keeping things just in case is not a defensible appraisal decision. Records, to my mind, just shouldn't be good. They should be good for something, some purpose. Otherwise, you're committing scarce or finite resources in terms of staff, time, space, and money to warehousing records. So I like to think of the so what rule. What does it matter if certain records are deemed archival or not? What is gained and what is lost? Your appraisal decisions should be documented so that others can understand the reasoning behind why certain records were retained. Good luck appraising. Contact the State Archives if you have any questions so that we can support your records management and archival efforts. And with that, thank you for listening.